The UFC has a problem. They cannot stop themselves from creating incredibly convoluted interim title situations.
Sure. Yeah, let's get it. A face-off.
I mean, we have Tom Aspinall defending an interim title, while John Jones, the supposed undisputed champion, is actively avoiding the fight. And the UFC is on board with it. So it kind of makes you think, what even is the point of an interim title if it isn't exactly that? A belt meant to hold over a division while the champion is getting ready to come back and, unify the titles. Well, what if I told you, dear viewer, that it wasn't always this way? Let me show you exactly what I mean. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point. Thank you so much to our channel Hall of Famers who make deep dives like this possible. And here is the long and messy story of every interim title in UFC history. The concept of an interim title is pretty simple. If for whatever reason the champion cannot fight for an extended period, an interim champion will be crowned. And then upon the return of the actual divisional title holder, a unification bout will take place. Piece of cake, right? In theory. In practice, not so much. At least the UFC's interim title history is nowhere near as convoluted as that of boxing's, where the promotion got the idea to make interim championships. There are currently, as of this writing, 11 interim champions between the WBO, WBC, WBA, and IBF. There was a time in the mid-2000s that the WBC flyweight champ was defending the actual title all the time, while an interim champion defended his belt regularly, and they never eventually fought. 2 years ago, the WBA was like, you know what? We've got too many belts, all interim titles are null, you're all mandatory challengers now, which is basically kind of like the same thing. Point being, it's consistently a hot mess. But then again, when isn't the boxing title picture? The very first UFC interim title fight took place a decade into the promotion's existence in 2003, and was about as messy as the situation gets, but was arguably a justified usage by the now 2-year-old Zuffa administration. The belt in this instance was being used as a way to force light heavyweight champion Tito Ortiz to fight Chuck Liddell. At least that was the plan. The friends turned rivals would have absolutely been the biggest fight the promotion could put on at the time, but Tito was actively avoiding it. Depending on who you believe, it was about money, fear, or a combination of both.
Chuck was in Tito's head big time because every time they trained together, that was it, man. Tito would get beat up. I'm talking drop him on the ground and Tito refusing to get back up.
Training's training, fights are fights. And for Dana to say I was scared to fight a man, that's just him trying to sell a fight. I'm not afraid to fight no man.
I'm afraid of no man, yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, he knew better, that's why he didn't want to fight me.
I just thought in my mind that, when the multi-million-dollar fights came about, Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell's names would be at the top.
Tito can talk about money or whatever else he wants to talk about. It's a fucking crock of shit.
But 196 days into his holdout, the UFC had Randy Couture move down from back-to-back title losses at heavyweight to lose to Chuck. At least that was the plan. Obviously, Randy was an elite fighter, but the general feeling at the time was that the best of his career was behind him. This was meant to be a showcase for Chuck. That, of course, turned out to be entirely wrong, and the underdog Couture would TKO Liddell in the 3rd round, forcing a unification bout with Tito Ortiz.
Tito Ortiz holds the belt, but due to a movie commitment, he couldn't defend his title recently.
Hey, we need to set the record straight because Tito's been dodging Chuck for a long time and it had nothing to do with the movie commitment, so I don't know where he gets that.
The last time I looked on my waist, I still got the belt right here.
Yep, I got a belt too, bud. You're the one who made the belt a joke in the first place by dodging Chuck for so long. You remember this guy right here?
Randy would spank Tito, literally, and take some of the heat off the biggest fight ever, as Liddell and Ortiz would finally throw down a year later, but without any gold on the line. With that situation, the interim cat was out of the bag, and would set up 27 other usages of the championship throughout the history of the promotion. The second instance would occur 2 years later, and be because of the first long-term injury a champion had suffered while holding a title. 25-year-old Frank Mir looked like the future of mixed martial arts, and 8 fights into his career, he would emphatically take the UFC Heavyweight Championship by breaking Tim Sylvia's arm in under a minute. But just 3 months later, a motorcycle accident would see Mir sidelined indefinitely.
I see a car taking a left-hand turn, and he's doing what most people do. They wait till the light turns yellow, and then they zip across traffic to, yielding right away. So when I zipped forward, he accelerated, and he gunned it hard. I remember one big thunk on the back of my head, which I guess was the curb of the sidewalk hitting my helmet. And then I kind of did a little bit of a cartwheel. I had gone about 80 feet, they said. I threw up my own helmet, couldn't get my helmet off fast enough. Broke my leg, tore my knee up to pieces, almost lost my toe for a little bit, but it was hinged on enough that they sewed it back together. They take me in the back of the ambulance, and I remember sitting there really controlling my breathing, just focusing to slow my heart rate down, because if I was going to bleed out, I wanted to make sure it was as slow and gave myself as much opportunity as possible to survive this and make it to the hospital.
At the time, Frank was scheduled to defend his title against Andrei Arlovski, so the Pitbull was given an interim title bout instead with former champion Tim Sylvia, a bout he would win in under a minute. With Mir's recovery taking longer than anticipated, the UFC threw Arlovski into another interim title bout, this time with Justin Eilers. Andre would successfully defend his temporary title with a TKO victory. The plan was then to finally have a unification bout in October of 2005, but with the prognosis that Mir would not be ready for that date, he was finally stripped after 419 days, and Arlovski was upgraded to undisputed champion. The two would eventually meet in the cage a decade later, with Andre beating Frank via unanimous decision.
What Andre's done coming back into the UFC and going on the run that he's gone on, it's amazing. I don't know if many people picked Arlovski in that fight.
The third ever interim UFC champion is one people almost always forget about because they tend to only remember the biggest upset of all time and the rematch that followed. But those two events were a full year apart with interim gold between them. After George St. Pierre shockingly dropped the welterweight title to tough winner Matt Serra in his first defense, the future legend was not given an immediate rematch. In fact, Serra was meant to defend his title against Matt Hughes after the pair coached a season of The Ultimate Fighter together, but Serra would injure his back a month before the bout, leaving GSP, who had beat Josh Koscheck in the meantime, to conclude his epic trilogy of title fights with rival Hughes, this time for interim gold.
Because we're crazy fans too, and I don't want to see Matt Hughes and George St. Pierre fight for 3 rounds. I want to see him fight for 5.
It's funny, I found out that Matt Serra was out of the fight through the internet. It's amazing that I didn't get a call that morning, but he called me back and said, this is who said no to the fight, and this is who you can fight. And I chose George.
Lending even more weight to that belt and setting up his redemption against Serra, who he would demolish in their second encounter to unify the titles. Interestingly enough, it was at the post-fight press conference for GSP's interim title bout with Hughes that our next interim championship fight would be announced.
I think this is a bigger picture than what guys make. Couture's up to something. I don't know what the end game is here. He just signed a new contract 8 months ago, and 8 months later now, apparently he's not happy with it.
Everybody's trying to make a big deal out of the money. And this was never a money issue. It's been a prevailing feeling of respect that wasn't being given.
2 months earlier, Randy Couture would walk out on the UFC over pay, over not getting to fight Fedor, and a whole host of other issues. The resignation complicated the heavyweight title picture because old Cap had managed to come out of retirement and secure that belt against Tim Sylvia earlier that year. Rather than strip the champion, the promotion played the long game, assuming they would eventually work things out with Couture. And so they would set up an interim title fight between the newly acquired Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira and, you guessed it, Tim Sylvia. Poor Tim would be subbed again, and Big Nog would hold that interim gold, but he would not get that fight with Randy, at least not with the belt on the line. To buy themselves more time, the UFC announced Nogueira would coach a season of Tough against Frank Mir, and then they'd have a title fight afterwards, presumably for the then vacant heavyweight championship if the UFC couldn't get Couture back. But they did, which led to this weird situation where Randy returned to defend the heavyweight title against obvious future megastar Brock Lesnar, the pay-per-view before Big Nog was set to take on Mir.
It is a return that is relative to the sport every bit as big as Brett Favre's. On November 15th, this guy, Randy Couture, will climb back into the UFC's octagon, a 45-year-old, 3-time heavyweight champ, against this guy, rising superstar Brock Lesnar, and we are pleased to welcome you both. Why this fight for you now?
Well, why not?
So rather than strip the interim title from Minotauro, they did another interim championship bout, with Mir emerging victorious, setting up his legendary unification showdown with Lesnar at UFC 100. Nogueira and Couture would throw down after the fact with no gold on the line, but they put on an all-time classic. The heavyweight division's messy history would continue during Lesnar's reign, as the champion would be continually sidelined due to diverticulitis. What was meant to be a heavyweight title defense against undefeated juggernaut Shane Carwin at UFC 106 moved to 108, and then became an interim title bout with Carwin taking on Frank Mir at 111 when it became clear that there was no timeline for Brock's return. Shane would smash Frank in the first round and get his big money mega fight with the returning Lesnar that summer, where he would lose the unification bout in spectacular fashion. And with that, heavyweight would finally see a bit of a long break here between all those back-to-back interim title situations, but don't worry, they'll be back in a bit. A few years later, GSP and that welterweight title picture would become a big ol' mess again. Originally slated to take on the champ in his debut, Nick Diaz would no-show his media obligations.
He snuck out the back door of Caesar's Gracie's house. So then Caesar's been looking for him all over town and his friends. I called Nate Diaz. I told Nate. Nate's like, yeah, I hear you. You know, it's just like, it's not like any of those guys are shocked or, if I knew this was gonna happen, I would have never made the fight. Why waste my time, money, energy, and embarrass everybody?
I'm sorry I didn't make it to the beauty pageant, but you know, I've never not showed up to a fight or whatever, but now it looks like they get to save money and I don't get paid, and I'm locked in a new contract. All these deal makers making deals, you know, all I know is I'm ready to fight, so.
Yes, I do believe he has maybe some mental issues, you know, but it's nothing bad. I do have some issues too, but maybe he has problem with social skills. The way he deal with the camera, maybe he has problem dealing with camera.
Which meant now Nick Diaz, who would get demoted to the co-main event against BJ Penn, with Carlos Condit instead getting a shot at St. Pierre. But the champ was forced out due to a knee injury, and Condit chose to wait for his newly earned shot. A shot he would not get, as Diaz put on a performance against Penn and the UFC shifted plans. That was until GSP had to pull out of that fight as well with another knee injury, so in order to save UFC 143, an interim title bout was made between Condit and Diaz, resulting in a victory for Carlos, although if you ask any fans of Nick, it's Diaz 125.
I already know that. Everybody knows that.
Anyway, a full 567 days since his last fight as champion, GSP would unify the welterweight title against Condit before going on to finally have that scheduled fight with Nick Diaz. Big ol' mess finally cleaned up. A few months after Condit's interim title victory, the longest and in many ways most frustrating interim title reign in UFC history would begin. This saga would see Renan Barão win interim bantamweight gold against Uriah Faber and maintain that title for a record 2 defenses due to the unending injuries of champion Dominic Cruz. Finally set for a unification bout, a month out from the date, Cruz would suffer yet another long-term rehabilitation after a groin tear and finally vacated the title 828 days after his last defense, allowing the UFC to promote Barão to undisputed champion. The two would never end up fighting each other either.
You had one of the most horrific injury streaks in the sport, in your prime.
I had everything that I thought I needed and wanted. Blew my knee out, get my belt stripped, go through 3 ACL reconstructions. You soon find out that you actually have no idea who you are. It was just a non-stop fight to just get healthy. And then it was kind of like, that's when it kind of turned reality. Like, you're not the champ. You didn't really lose it, but that's it. So what are you gonna do? Because we all hit low points in our life where it's unbearable. And you either allow it to continue to be unbearable and just deny it, or you deal with the task at hand. I have gotten the gift of feeling retired during my career. Who else gets that? That could only happen because I let go of control of the things I couldn't control.
Would you believe in 2014 that heavyweight needed another interim title fight? Yes, the division with the most interim championship bouts ever, at 9 if we count the scheduled Aspinall Blades bout, has double any other weight class in the UFC. This time around, Fabricio Verdum was scheduled to challenge champion Cain Velasquez after they coached a season of tough Latin America, but 3 weeks out, Cain blew out his knee, and so Mark Hunt stepped in for interim gold and lost to Verdum, who would be the first and only ever heavyweight interim champion to actually win a unification bout. Next, the UFC would crown arguably its most important interim champion ever, and one I'm sure they were on the edge of their seats praying succeeded. After a ridiculously expensive build-up to what was meant to be Conor McGregor's featherweight title challenge against the legendary Jose Aldo, 3 weeks before the tentpole event, Aldo would be forced out with a broken rib.
This is what you call a rude awakening. He broke his fucking rib.
Oh my god. Body shot?
Sounds like
He's a body shot?
Yeah.
He got hit with a body shot?
Mm-hmm.
Who, where?
whatever it is getting fucked up bad.
McGregor, who was injured himself, somehow convinced the UFC to let him fight Chad Mendes on the date for interim gold.
I am number 1. So if you are number 1, who gives a shit if number 2 steps out in place of number 3? At the end of the day, I'm number 1.
Aldo's a pussy. Usually the Brazilians show up and fight, battle through. You know, if I was to jump under an X-ray machine, I'm sure a couple of little knocks and bruises would show up on me too.
And everything would work out perfectly, with Conor getting the biggest win of his career, setting up the eventual unification bout with Aldo, who would get knocked out in 13 seconds. After the legendary win, Conor would sit on that belt for 210 days while he scrapped with Nate Diaz at welterweight, forcing the UFC to make interim gold again, this time held by Aldo after he defeated Frankie Edgar. This just so happens to also mark the end of the original Zuffa era, going into the WME era after the sale, which went through literally the morning after UFC 200.
The largest deal in the history of sports will officially be revealed to the world this morning by the UFC. We have the information tonight, a $4 billion deal.
What's also worth noting is that there were 15 interim title fights in UFC history up through 200, a whole 19 years, and in just the 8 years since, there have been 14 more, including Aspinall versus Blades. Not only has the volume gone up, but a lot of them are a bit more dubious. You could argue that Nagmir after Lesnar Couture wasn't needed, but that's a pretty minor offense. There are far more egregious shenanigans to come. After 350 days of inactivity in the division, 2 weeks after he moved up to 155 and won the title, Conor was stripped of his featherweight championship. Then just 2 weeks after they promoted Aldo to undisputed, the UFC would make arguably the most pointless interim title bout ever, pitting Max Holloway against Anthony Pettis just to make an event poster look better after UFC 206 was snake-bit with injuries at the top of the card.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't my decision to make this a title fight, you know, so I was at my house. It's Merry Christmas to me. Thank you.
Originally, it was Daniel Cormier versus Anthony Johnson for the light heavyweight title. Then it became Anthony Pettis versus Max Holloway for the interim featherweight title. And now it's just Max Holloway versus Anthony Pettis as a result of Anthony Pettis missing weight.
Max would win the fight and unify the title by defeating Aldo, thus ending this mess at 145. But Conor wasn't done holding up divisions though, as he would go 511 days without defending the lightweight title he was stripped of his featherweight title for, an absence largely due to him boxing Floyd Mayweather, which forced a lightweight interim champion to be crowned in Tony Ferguson after he defeated Kevin Lee.
He needs to defend or vacate. If he doesn't vacate, he needs to defend it. But I'm gonna tell you what, just set it down, Conor, and just fucking walk away.
Conor, this Floyd thing popped up. It popped up. The thing that the interim belts are good for is you don't clog up the division. You don't have guys sitting around waiting. There's no question now who gets the shot at Conor.
Given the length of time and no clear indicator of when Conor would return, the most obvious possible fight that would resolve this situation was to set up Tony and Khabib. That was until disaster struck, when Ferguson was injured by a production cable right before his scheduled vacant title match with Khabib Nurmagomedov.
I was fucking convinced. I told Jamie, I told Jimmy Smith, I'm like, I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. It's April Fools. This shit's coming out on April Fools. Fuck you, man. There's no fucking way Tony Ferguson got hurt a week before the fight.
That's the first thing I thought. I'm like, oh my God, everyone's going to think this is April Fool's. His LCL's detached from his knee, according to...
So it's pulled from the bone.
Those thick cables that they lay...
Yeah.
Apparently he tripped over one and fell. Fuck.
That's insane.
It's the craziest thing ever.
It's insane.
It's so crazy.
Given the length of time and no clear indicator of when Conor would return, both real champ and temporary one were stripped, thus ending the Conor McGregor-fueled interim title extravaganza that was 2015 through 2018. While all of that was going on though, stripped former light heavyweight champion Jon Jones was returning from his hit-and-run suspension and was to get an immediate title challenge against now champion Daniel Cormier. But DC injured his foot 3 weeks out, so Jon Jones would fight Ovince St. Preux for another pointless interim title. To be fair, I think Jon really wanted to fight after that long layoff. That probably factored into it too. Nonetheless, a sluggish Jones would get the victory.
You said you didn't want the belt. Do you want it now, and why did you, sort of in the heat of the moment, or do you feel like that was...
This interim belt?
The interim
belt. It's cool and all. It's nice and shiny here. You know, it makes me feel good. You know, I took some pictures with it and everything, but this thing it's kind of made up. It's kind of fake.
Jones would be stripped 200 days later due to a PED test fail in the lead up to the unification bout with Cormier.
The reality is, you can't fail drug tests.
You could pass 100 tests. You cannot fail one. He disqualified himself by taking a steroid before the fight, so it didn't happen. So now I get the belt back.
The middleweight division went from completely unmarred by the need for interim gold all the way up to the year 2017 to an absolute disaster weight class. The first trouble would come when champion Michael Bisping,
no one gives a fuck, Josh. Everybody, I'm sorry I'm late,
who had signed up for a big-time money fight with the returning George St. Pierre, opted to rest his injured knee when the bout fell apart temporarily and he was going to be facing Yoel Romero.
I love you, man! I love you, man! Let's fight right now! I'm a caveman!
The UFC then used that date for an interim title bout between Romero and Robert Whittaker. After a war, Whittaker would come out on top, but never see that Bisping unification bout, as he would lose the gold to St. Pierre, who then vacated the title due to a bout of colitis, promoting Robert to undisputed champion. In total, Bisping versus GSP and its delays would hold up the division for 425 days.
George St. Pierre and I had a deal. He was going to fight Bisping at 185 pounds, and if he won, he would defend the title. He bailed on that. Didn't do it. So you can't just come out and handpick fights that you want for titles.
Things wouldn't get any easier though at 185, as Whittaker would have a whole host of his own issues. First, he would be forced out of his first title defense against Luke Rockhold due to an infection that led to chickenpox just a few months after being promoted, which would give Romero a second try at interim gold against Rockhold to fill in the headliner for that pay-per-view. But Yoel would miss weight, making himself ineligible to hold the interim title if he were to win the bout, which he did, making for the most forgotten interim championship ever since nobody won the thing.
It was really thrown in there very last second. I mean, it wasn't really necessary.
It's potentially the least meaningful interim fight that we've ever seen in UFC history.
Yoel would then miss weight in the title bout that non-interim title victory earned him, and so the undisputed middleweight championship sat on the shelf technically undefended for 701 days. And that's because after his non-title defense against Romero, Whittaker was again forced out of a title bout, this time literal hours before the card, due to an abdominal hernia. He was meant to fight fellow tough coach Kelvin Gastelum. Instead, Kelvin would compete in possibly the greatest interim title bout ever against Israel Adesanya, with Izzy coming out on top and eventually unifying the title less than a year later, leaving Whittaker to lose his belt in what was technically his first ever defense. During that whole mess at middleweight, welterweight was having a bit of a strange situation with interim gold as well.
And I might say some ratchet stuff, I might drop some bombs and Fs, so give me the pass today.
Champion Tyron Woodley would defend his 170-pound title in a lackluster showing against Damian Maia that saw the champion tear his labrum, forcing him out for what would end up being over a year. Colby Covington, who had recently become infamous for calling Brazilians filthy animals, would earn an interim title after soundly defeating Rafael dos Anjos in the champion's absence. Covington had been verbally building up quite a rivalry with Woodley.
Tyron Woodley's hiding. He's been running from me the whole time. He was offered to fight me, and he was good to fight GSP or Diaz, but all of a sudden he has a hurt shoulder and he can't fight. But, you know, I'm down to fight him tomorrow. I'll fight him the day after Chicago. I'm always ready for that little easy fight.
I want him never to fight again.
Tyron, whoa, you want to end his career?
I want to end his life.
And their unification bout was becoming one of the hottest tickets in town. That was until it never happened. They were meant to fight at UFC 228, but Covington needed surgery on his sinuses and could not make the date, so just 90 days after he earned interim gold, Colby would be stripped, and Woodley would instead fight and defeat Darren Till. When Covington wasn't given the next title challenge after being stripped, he continued to carry around his stripped interim title and famously confronted UFC president Dana White live on social media over the slight.
Dana, what's up, bro? How you doing? How you doing? I just want an explanation why I'm not fighting for the belt this weekend.
Stop filming.
Come on, bro.
He would eventually get his chance at the gold, just not against Woodley. Did I say earlier that we were done talking about Conor-related interim title shenanigans? Well, I lied.
He's done it! That is a fact!
Fucking little bastard!
After a 2-year layoff, McGregor would lose a lightweight title bout to champion Khabib Nurmagomedov, who would see himself suspended for 9 months after hopping the cage post-fight and trying to beat up Dylan Danis. 6 months into the suspension, the UFC decided they needed there to be an interim title, and so they pitted fan favorite Dustin Poirier against current featherweight champion Max Holloway. The boys would put on a banger the same night Adesanya and Gastelum had their iconic interim title bout. It was the night of too many interim titles. Dustin would defeat Max and get his shot at Khabib, but of course, succumbed to the Eagle. Former interim champion Tony Ferguson was next in line for a shot at Khabib, having still never lost since being stripped. But this cursed fight was never meant to be, as COVID travel restrictions would prevent Nurmagomedov from leaving Russia, and so another interim title bout was set up, this time between Ferguson and Justin Gaethje. Tony's 12-fight win streak would sadly finally be broken.
Honestly, I feel a little bit bad, and same time I understand Tony Ferguson's time is finished. You know, now he gonna come back, someone gonna beat him again. When you take damage like this, you never gonna be same. Never ever.
Setting up a unification bout between Gaethje and Khabib in Abu Dhabi, where the champion would unify the titles and then retire from the sport. Perhaps the highest drama involving an interim title came next, with the whole Francis Ngannou situation. The heavyweight champion took the division's crown with a single fight left on his contract, and negotiations weren't exactly going great to get him to renew.
I would like to stay in the UFC, but I don't feel like the UFC still want me to stay. You know?
Think there will come a day where you're standing in a boxing ring with Tyson Fury?
I hope so.
The problem was compounded when the UFC asked Ngannou to fight Derek Lewis during the summer, but because of some issues outside of fighting, Francis was unable to get back to the US to train properly, so he informed the UFC he would be 100% good to go in September for that fight. According to Ngannou, the UFC was on board, but then a few days later announced an interim title fight between Lewis and Cyril Gane. After taking some shots at the champ in the pay-per-view intro, former teammate Gane would defeat Lewis and set up a high-stakes unification bout, with Ngannou having decided to fight out his contract and bet on himself, assuming he would win. Despite two bum wheels, Francis got the victory, unified the needlessly separated titles, and a year later left and went on and made a big old bag in boxing. Next, we had another justifiable interim title situation. Aljamain Sterling very controversially won the bantamweight title from Petr Yan via a disqualification in a fight he was losing pretty badly, and so an immediate rematch was set up, but Sterling was having neck issues that required surgery, leaving the champ off the shelf for a total of 399 days. So understandably, the UFC put Yan in an interim title fight with Corey Sandhagen, whom he defeated, but he would then turn around and lose legit to Sterling in their rematch, to the surprise of pretty much everyone.
You better win your fight, because I'm coming on your ass, boy. Pause.
Brandon Moreno might have only gotten his fourth flyweight title fight with Davison Figueiredo because of an interim situation. The two had fought 3 times and were 1-1-1, with Figgy coming out on top in their most recent encounter. Fans were fine with a quad fight, but there were rumblings that Kai Kara-France might get the nod next. As fate would have it though, Figueiredo would get injured and be shelved for a year, and so it became KKF versus Moreno for interim gold, with Brandon scoring the TKO victory, ensuring his final showdown with Davison, a fight he would win with a doctor stoppage to unify the flyweight titles and put their awesome rivalry to rest. Just last year, the UFC had a pretty unique setup for a featherweight interim title fight, one you could again argue had no point. There was no injury or layoff to speak of. Champion Alexander Volkanovski was stepping up to lightweight to take on champion Islam Makhachev in a super fight, and the co-main event would be Yair Rodriguez versus Josh Emmett for the interim featherweight title. So while you could consider that a glorified number one contenders fight, given that Volk could have won at 155 and potentially stayed there for a long period, the interim belt made a bit more sense. Yair would win the co-main event, with Alex coming up just short of that second title, and so the two would meet and unify 145 later that year, with the Volkster coming out on top with a TKO victory. Which takes us to the sticky situation we find ourselves in with Tom Aspinall, who, as I mentioned in the intro, will be just the 4th fighter ever to have to defend an interim title. This time it's really just because the UFC and Jon Jones do not want to make the fight. The whole situation started when, in the lead up to his big NYC Legacy showdown with Stipe Miocic, newly crowned heavyweight champion Jon Jones tore his pec right off the bone, an injury absolutely worthy of an interim title fight. While the bigger buzz at the time was surrounding opponent Sergey Pavlovich, Aspinall would dump the sport on its head and KO his juggernaut opponent in 69 seconds. Nice. Since then, despite some teasing by Jon, the interim champion has been in limbo, with the UFC adamant that the Jones-Miocic fight will happen no matter what. Tom's been left with really no choice but to defend a temporary title in Manchester, because who knows what would have happened had he sat around. They might have stripped him like they did with Colby. Should Aspinall win, it's more likely he'll be promoted to undisputed champion, then get a chance to earn it against Jon Jones. But such is the way these things go, as you have now seen thoroughly. And yeah, that was the history of all 29 interim title fights in the UFC. A long, winding, sometimes confusing journey. While many times layoffs due to injury entirely justified interim title fights, often the UFC would just use the belt as a tool or something that looked nice on a poster, a trend that clearly got worse starting with the McGregor era on. This ongoing situation with Aspinall is definitely one of the worst usages of the interim title, but if today's history lesson has shown us anything, to paraphrase Homer Simpson, it's the worst usage of the interim title so far. I'll tell you who's always undisputed though, the editor of this video, Luke Taylor. This project was a monster, but they absolutely killed it. Please go follow him and show him love on his socials, and go check out his awesome YouTube channel. A massive thanks to our channel Hall of Famers, because long pieces like this are easier to do with your support and we appreciate it so much. If you would like to show us that level of support and get exclusive content while you do it, hit that join button right down there below the video. Like and subscribe to defeat Tim Sylvia in an interim title fight. Leave a comment down below about what you think of the UFC's current usage of interim titles. And thank you so much for watching, you guys. I love doing history deep dives like this. Have a fantastic day.